we need to run a little bit of silicone wire off of this 5-volt lead right in here so that we're able to power our flight controller and receiver off of that. And then we'll go ahead and do the same thing with a negative wire off of the ground over here on this side, and that's just going onto the main ground rail, as all grounds are shared. And then we're going to go ahead and start looking at putting the FPV system wired into this OSD, because with this system you do need to tap down into this, and you'd rather get everything that you can wired up and ready to go before you put that flight controller back on here and get everything screwed down. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and take just a moment and I'll solder the power leads for the flight controller. Alright, so now we have these two leads here. Those are going to route over to our flight controller to power that, and then our receiver should power off of the flight controller. We're going to go ahead and start looking at what we need to do to get this OSD wired up. We probably should have taken a look at this before we got all these wires in the way, so kind of plan around that. Know that the more you put on, the harder it's going to be to get to some of the smaller, tighter spots in the builds. But again, I'm going to use this little zip tie trick that I mentioned before, just to kind of use these as sort of temporary levers to get some wires out of the way. So I'm going to go ahead and zip these guys all out of the way so that they're sort of just tightened over against this standoff here. I guess it's just a screw, but will eventually be a standoff. So then you see they're kind of not flopping around like spaghetti in the wind anymore. So go ahead and put all the rest of these underneath here. We'll push these sort of off to the side here. Just get everything sort of out of the way. Now we got this nice clean place to work. So now this is going to go ground power signal. So we're going to need to find our camera here. Alright, so here's a little micro camera, and as I mentioned at the beginning of the video series, if the camera will focus, you'll see the little microphone here. It's this circle here, this little guy right there. So we are actually going to go ahead and remove this. I always just sort of snip them off. You can desolder them if you'd like. This is the quick and easy way to do it. And then we need to look at these wires and figure out which one is which. So, alright, so it looks like white is audio, red is power, black is ground. So pretty standard. Alright, so since the microphone was removed, we don't have any need for the white cable, which is actually the audio cable there. So we're just going to go ahead and snip that right off. And then, in fact, this entire connector here, I usually like to hang on to these connectors just in case you need one. And if you look, the length of the entire quad, if you need to run these wires from the front, which is this side of the quad, all the way to the back, you only need a few. You know, you don't need too much wire. You like to leave yourself a little bit of slack, so I'm going to snip this off somewhere right around in here. I don't need to get that white wire in there, so we'll snip that off there. Just throw this extra connector somewhere. I have a little drawer where I save all of them, just in case, you know, there's been many a time where I've wound up needing one or two of them, and they break and whatnot. So we'll go ahead and strip these guys off. We'll get these tinned up and prepared for to solder them right into the OSD here. Now again, the nice thing about this OSD, the Power OSD from Quad Revo, is that you don't have to do any configuring. So it's actually supposed to be ready to go right out of the box. I've never actually used one of these before, but they seem very straightforward. And just looking at how simple this is to wire everything up, I almost kind of prefer this to using your standard thing, just because since there's these dedicated pads, I'm kind of, you know, it's fresh in my mind that I have to slow down and wire up the FPV system. Usually I come back and do this at the very end and just kind of tap into whatever power voltages I need to as something of an afterthought, but this is such an integral part of the build, we're going to go ahead and do it right now. So we need to actually reference online what ports in the Power OSD are what. From right to left, it goes signal plus minus, and then your VTX is actually this one on the outside and your camera is on the inside. So since we're using these teeny tiny little wires here for this camera, the first thing that we need to do is remember to route these straight through this 3D print. Now this is the mount that we're going to be using, and once the camera's in there, it's pretty much in there to stay. So you actually have to desolder these wires to get this thing out of here, which is something of an inconvenience, but the entire board is direct soldered too. So what I've done in the past, or what I've had suggested to me to do in the past rather, is to actually rig up these guys on a little plug. But unfortunately I don't have crimpers, so I figure if you're breaking the print or breaking the camera or something, you got some work to do anyway, so might as well just keep it all built in together. So if I did my measurements right, hopefully this guy's just going to slide right on in here. It's going to be a little tight because I designed it to fit very snugly. I want to make sure to slide this in there without damaging any of the FETs in the back of the board or popping anything off of the camera. Alright, so this guy's in there. It's not in there quite as snug as I would have liked. This particular print went ahead and shrunk on me a little bit more than I had accounted for, but it's in there, so we're going to go ahead and wire this up. So from right to left, we go signal positive minus. So we'll do that. So we actually need to tin these guys here. Alright, so we've got our video camera mounted in this little print. It's a little tight. We may switch this out later, but for right now that'll do just fine. It's in there and secure. And actually the gap in the bottom leaves a little bit of room for the wires to breathe, which is kind of nice. We've also got that wired up to the OSD in here. So we're going to go ahead and find our video and power cable for this guy, the video transmitter, the Hawkeye, and get that wired up here. And this once again will go into the OSD right there. Alright, so we wound up wiring the signal wire from the camera into the OSD, but that OSD outputs about 10 volts from what I checked with the multimeter. So we're going to go ahead and wire this positive lead over here to the 5 volt step down thing, and then we're also going to put our ground just on the shared ground here. Let's go ahead and do that really quickly. Get just a clean guy there. This non-silicone wire, especially in this teeny tiny gauge, is very prone to just sort of melting. It's not necessarily the best stuff to work with. So we're going to go ahead and run our VTX. Once again, you don't need to leave too much wire. You don't want too much hanging out inside of it, but you also want to leave yourself a little bit of wiggle room. You never want to cut anything shorter than you have to, and you never want to leave anything longer than you have to. So it's kind of just finding that balance of what the right length is for all of your wires, for all of your components in whatever build you're doing. Alright, so this guy goes from between 6 and 24 volts, and our OSD is actually giving us 10 volts, so we're just going to go ahead and put it on here. I think that'll actually be perfectly fine. We're going to need a little bit more of a tin on these pads here. Alright, so now this guy should be powering our video transmitter. Now, one thing that you want to do before you test anything out at this point is make sure that you plug an antenna into your VTX. You never want to power up a video transmitter without an antenna on. If you do, all of that power flowing through it has nowhere to go and be dissipated, whereas an antenna sort of helps you out there and will make it so that power doesn't just sit there in the body of the transmitter and just burn itself out. So one of the great things for that are those stupid rubber ducky antennas that come with just about everything that you buy. Wow, I cannot get this thing in. Anyway, I just so happen to have a correct antenna for this guy right here. So we'll screw this in just so that we don't fry the VTX when we power it on. Now this guy has a power LED on it somewhere. We'll go ahead and plug battery voltage in. We'll give it one more look over. We got signal ground wire, signal ground wire. Now we're not going to actually be powering the camera or transmitting any videos, but we're just going to check and make sure that our video transmitter does have power, which it does, so that's good. And our camera should also be getting power as it's going off of the 5 volt rail there. We'll go ahead and multimeter that just to be sure. One last time, although at this point it's probably too late, and if it's been on this long, the camera's already gone. But we'll just double check. So ground to ground, and then we'll get down in here into the 5 volt. Oh, guess we need to turn on the multimeter first. So ground to ground, get down in there in the 5 volt, and yep, 5 volts still going out. So we should be good to go. So now that that's done, our next step is going to be to finish up the FPV system by taking this other wire that goes with your video transmitter, figuring out which cables that you need, and then wiring up that to the OSD. Now, this cable has a 5 volt off, which I probably could have used for the camera, but I figured that since this is direct wired into the camera right here, rather than go ahead and cut this wire off and solder the 2 wires and make a joint there. I just used the 5 volt there. 5 volt out of this and 5 volt out of there. It's going to be the same thing. They're both kind of just a basic 5 volt power. So we're actually going to remove every one of these cables except for the yellow one, because these two are your power out cables. Your yellow is your video signal. This should be a blue according to the diagram. So this should be your audio left and right, I believe. Yes. Yeah, so I don't know why these two aren't the right colors, but a little funky, but you never know what you're going to get when you order these hobby parts here. So I'm going to go ahead and try to remove these pins here. Now the best way to do this is to actually lift up those tabs very gently. You want to make sure not to bend them in case you need to reinsert these wires, and then actually let you pull out these wires with the crimp on there so that you still have this little guy here. If I can get the camera to focus. In case you need to reconnect it, you still have this guy here so that you can utilize that on another build if you have another plug that needs a random wire or something. If you cut one off your another VTX or something of that nature, hang on to those sort of things and just put them in a drawer somewhere. But the best way to do this is to just sort of, get a very small pointy object, barely lift that tab, be very gentle, don't bend it to the point where it won't go back into shape, and just give the wire a little tug, and then everything will fall back into place. And if you need to reinsert them, you can. They'll kind of just snap right back in there. So that's all of them out, and then all I have is the video cable. Kind of funky looking, that's all that we're running to there. This whole big connector just for the one little cable. I'm gonna go ahead and prime this little pad here, or tin this little pad here. I always say prime. That's not the right term. This might get hot, but I'm just gonna do it with my hands here. That guy in there, give it a nice little tug. This shouldn't be taking too much pressure, but you do always want to make sure that you have a nice solid solder joint. So then you can plug this guy into here. Alright, so we actually ran into a couple of snags here. We received a dead on arrival microcam. Luckily I had another one that I tore out of another Falcon 130 build, so we're going to go ahead and use that. I went ahead and routed the power back into the video receiver, or the video transmitter. This gives filtered and regulated 5 volt out, so just to be safe I ran that off of there, as well as the video cable goes to the OSD now, and then the video signal cable from the camera goes also to the corresponding spot on the OSD. So if we power up our quad, we should see on our screen here that we have video and OSD. So there we go. Alright, so that's looking good. The next step is going to be to start working on our flight controller. So once again we have an Afro Flight Nazerev 6. So we're going to go ahead and jump over to the next video, and we'll get started wiring up the power, the battery buzzer, and all those sorts of things that you do before you set the board down onto the frame, and then we'll start doing the ESCs and whatnot.